tired, and many of them have probably moved over to legalize cannabis as well as other parties. So it seemed like the cleanest move to make was to formally close the party, close the associated associations.
Yeah, and of course, you are one of those people who did move over. Whenabouts did you, I guess, make that formal move over to join legalized cannabis? And then also, how long has this Senate run been in the works?
Yeah. Look, it took quite a bit of arm twisting, I'd have to say, Leo. I had a great time in Parliament for those 8 years, and I honestly loved almost every minute of it. But I wasn't looking to go back into campaigning and back into a parliamentary role. And I spent a good bit of time last year mentoring the legalised cannabis MPs, because as new MPs, with a fairly powerful position on the crossbench, it was great to be able to share my experiences with them in getting them up and running and up to speed. But really joining the party and uh, putting my hand up to run for the Senate has only really been in the last 2.5 months. And I think that's also because the party's only been turning their head to a federal campaign and candidates over the last 2.5 months. But as I say, I've got a lot of friends in the legalised cannabis party, and there was really a little bit of unfinished business there for me personally around cannabis.
Yeah, now look, you had experience in the upper house, so I think you know enough about quotas and preferences and things like that. With the Senate here, I think off the top of my head, 3% of the vote legalized cannabis got in Victoria last election, which is not that far off where you need to be considering where Ralph Babet got in for the UAP. Realistically speaking, are you actually optimistic that you are able to get in? Because it would be, your party's first ever federal representative, and it would be quite an extraordinary step, especially considering that sixth seat, I guess, has kind of gone to what you'd say notionally the right? You've had it held by the coalition and now the UAP on different election cycles.
You're absolutely right, Leo. And that last six seat, it certainly is up for grabs, and it will depend. It really will depend on the way the preferences move on the night of the election as to what we'll see. It will depend on whether legalized cannabis is on how to vote cards for different parties. I mean, it will also depend on whether One Nation's on how to vote cards. So there's lots of variables in that, but I do think that we have got a chance. And again, legalized cannabis, a little bit like the sex party, it it attracts a broad range of people. It also, and to be quite honest, it also attracts a kind of disengaged and disaffected voter that goes, I'm just going to vote for the leaf on the ballot. So, you're not necessarily, I don't think the legalized cannabis party would be considered from the left. We're certainly not aligned with the socialists or the Greens. We'd be, as I always have been politically, really aligned in the centre. But yeah, the battle will be, I think, against those parties from the right. So One Nation, UAP, they might decide to throw a few $1 million into Victoria again, and possibly the Libertarians.
And just on the central issue, as you can imagine, from the party
Yeah,
legalizing
yeah,
cannabis, I
yeah.
think that there's a slogan, and I'm not exactly getting off the top of my head, but that I know the legalized cannabis party in Queensland has been using, which is something like one topic, many issues, or something like that. And I guess trying to move away from being considered entirely single issue. Really, what is the platform in terms of specifics? Because you can all just say legalized cannabis, and of course there are several parties that advocate for it, including
Oh,
obviously yourself, the
sure.
Greens, the Libertarian Party. What is,
Right.
I guess, the specific element of the legalized cannabis party's legalizing cannabis platform that makes you stand out and really should get you votes on this issue?
Look, legalized cannabis, as it says on the tin, is around regulating cannabis. And I think the approach that the party takes to that is quite different from other parties. So while libertarians would have a very deregulated model, we've seen the Greens bill on this, and it's an extraordinary regulated model that overrides the rights of the states and the rights of local governments in making decisions. Fundamentally, legalized cannabis is about choice. And not dissimilar to the sex party. It was about a freedom of choice. And it was about, again, that kind of addressing that nanny state. And I know that as I say that, well, the libertarians would say the same thing, but I think legalized cannabis does it, will do it in a different way and look at regulation, not deregulation, as we'd see with some of the other parties.
And just on legalized cannabis, I think one criticism that I see leveled against the party, and maybe it's just on social media, but I do see it, is that the party at some level with its state MPs, I know you've got four at the moment, is a bit disjointed. Pardon the pun, bit disjointed at the moment. Didn't even mean to do that. So really, is that, I guess, something that you have to address, or is a concern, given, I guess, that there have been some controversies with like your MPs in
Look, I know what you're
WA?
saying, Leo, and it's something that I'm really familiar with. Having founded the Sex Party, I'm really familiar with a fast-growing party that has those growing pains. Now, the Sex Party never achieved the success that legalized cannabis has. I mean, legalized cannabis has elected 5 state MPs in its very short life. Um, uh, Touching on your points around WA, certainly they're now down to 1 MP in WA. One of the MPs has resigned due to various differences with the party and I think with members in the party. But yeah, there is growing pains, and there's a small, fast-growing party. I think it's the 4th largest party in Australia now. And it's only been around really for 2 or 3 years in its current form. So I'm not worried about that. I see really experienced MPs like Jeremy Buckingham in New South Wales, um, being able to speak on a whole range of issues. Again, he holds balance of power. So as a crossbencher in those upper houses, he needs to make decisions on a whole range of issues, as I used to when I was in Parliament. Rachel Payne and David Edershank in Victoria also seem to be able to challenge the government in certain areas, but also uh, vote with confidence on a range of issues. And whether yes, the legalized cannabis party would be unapologetically uh, you know uh, for addressing climate change, for example, but the and that sort of works within their general policies. But yeah, it's a fast growing party. It's got the membership's going through the roof, and yeah, that does create strain, that's for sure.
And just quickly on that, and I know that you've had, 8 years of experience in the
Mm.
Victorian Upper House on a wide range of
Yeah,
issues, and you had, the Reason platform and the Sex platform before that. But, there will be plenty of voters who might be considering legalized cannabis in Victoria who don't know you or don't necessarily know your platform. And just
yeah,
on that about a Senate crossbench role, right? You would have to be going on a bunch of issues that you'd have to address,
yeah,
including, not just state issues, right? Huge international issues, major things that get huge national attention,
yeah.
with respect, probably bigger than you would have ever had it at the state level,
Right.
right?
That's
Um,
right.
how are you going to, I guess, assure that those potential voters know that you're a reliable voice, that is someone who
Yeah.
does know these issues, can talk about them, even if your party's platform is on that cannabis issue and your party's name is on
Yeah.
cannabis?
I I do hope that I will get the opportunity to assure voters in the lead up to the election that I have always voted with integrity. I've also always voted with evidence. So I worked very hard at the state level to get across every single piece of legislation that I was asked to vote on. I did not take any issue lightly. And I see that will be this. I see that no different in the Senate. I understand it will be a difficult role. In Victoria, every portfolio was my portfolio. So if we had a justice bill, I needed to understand it. If we had an energy bill, I needed to understand it. And the same will go for the Senate. And I agree with you, but if I was successful in the Senate, you're right. I will be needing to put that same rigor towards defence bills, that same rigor towards international relations and the types of national legislation that we will be facing. And I feel confident that I can use the experiences of getting across legislation in Victoria to help me at a federal level.
Look, it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how this plays out. I'm sure we'll catch up again in the months ahead. Fiona, Patten, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Leo.
Well, the Northern Territory Greens have gained their first ever seat in history, with Kate McNamara defeating former Chief Minister Natasha Fyles in Nightcliff. Labor will have just 4 members when Parliament returns in October, compared to the Country Liberal Party's 17. Leo Puglisi caught up with the new MP.
Well, look, great to have you here. Congratulations. First ever MP for the Northern Territory Greens. It's a huge achievement. How big is this, I guess, for the Greens as a movement in the Northern Territory, and also for the policies that you've been pushing for quite some time in the many parliament runs that the NT Greens have gone for?
Yeah, thank you so much, Leo. And I mean, you're right. It's a really big deal. It's an historic win for us. The Green movement here has been going for decades. And so we've had people working at this for a long time, but we have had a massive growth we've quadrupled our membership in the last 18 months. We've got an incredible group of volunteers, over 100 volunteers from Mbant to Alice Springs up to the top end. And we've run a really, really great, thorough campaign of getting out there, talking to people in the electorates. I mean, we've been door knocking since last year, having really fantastic conversations with people about and listening to them. What are their concerns? What do they feel that is missing or lacking in politics? And so much has come back to people feeling like the community is not being represented, and that there's an integrity crisis in our politics, so that vested interests and big business have too much influence in our politics, as well as concerns around environment and community safety and crime. They were the big issues that people wanted to be heard on.
Yeah, and obviously it wasn't just you in terms of successes for the Greens and being able to, I guess, even get some of the vote swings that candidates in like Fanny Bay and Breitling got was an achievement in itself, especially compared to previous elections. I think you touched on it there, but I guess what really changed for this campaign? Was it part of it just being the mood of the electorate? Was it a combination of looking at, I guess, some of the other tactics that have worked in other states? I know you mentioned door knocking. The Queensland Greens have obviously been huge on that, which helped for the 2022 election. Was there any, I guess, one thing that swung it, or was it a bit of a combination?
Look, a combination, I think, and you're right to talk about the other electorates too, because even though we didn't win a seat there, it still feels like a massive win for us. The 30% swing in Breitling, I think, might be unprecedented. I think is the largest swing the Greens nationally have ever had. And, Suki and Fanny Bay came really close. I think it's a combination of we just had a huge growth in our movement, and people willing to get out there and join the movement as volunteers. But also, I think, a growing dissatisfaction with the general population around their politics and the direction that we were heading in. People we heard again and again and again on the doors where they were so unhappy with the major two parties, felt like that nothing was ever improving, and they weren't seeing what was important to them being put on the table, and they were just ready for a change. And yeah, I'm sure things interstate as well have played a part, like the big swings to Greens in other areas as well. People are starting to understand now that the Greens are not just a one-issue party. We're not just for the environment. And they were so keen to hear what we had to say about renters' rights and about domestic violence and about all these other issues which we feel quite passionately about. And when we got to go on the doors and explain our policies and initiatives, it was really well received.
And again, you just touched on it right at the end, those policies and the issues that you were really running on. What are you going to be pushing for in the first couple of weeks being elected to Parliament? And again, it just has to show that, or it cannot be understated that, this is the first time the Greens are going to have a voice in the NT Parliament to get all those NT Greens positions in there. Anything in particular you're looking for in the first couple of weeks and months?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first couple of weeks, I'm just trying to wrap my head around this new role and what I have to do, because obviously it's a first for all of us. We sort of won the election and went, right, what happens now? So that's going to be our first step, and is, we've got our membership, and it's really important that the membership, the Greens membership, feel heard, but it's also obviously about the community. And so because I'm a big part of the community here, I'll still be out having conversations with everyone that I meet on the street and at the shops around what they want to see us bring to the table in Parliament. But we have, the big issues that we're hearing are crime and community safety, integrity in politics, and people feel like they're not being put first, and the environment and climate is very big up here. We're looking at governments that want to create an onshore fracking industry, and fracking in particular has been a big hot button topic in my electorate in Nightcliff. Most people, I can say, do not want fracking to go ahead in the Northern Territory, and this was a really big issue that got brought up again and again. So like all those three things and more will be what I'll be looking at to put on the table when I start.
Goes without saying the CLP won a pretty big majority. How are you going to make sure that your voice is heard when, unicameral parliament, they can bypass you, the crossbench, the opposition? How are you going to make sure that you're able to be effective over the next 4 years?
Yeah, good question. Look, I'm excited, first of all, to get to go and meet the other crossbench members. And, my role, as well as being a solo Green in there, is going to be around scrutinising legislation, bringing transparency to the public. This is a big issue we've had here in the Territory, where the public have asked questions and we could never fully get answers from our government. So, we had last year a group of parents and doctors travelled all the way to Canberra to ask for a Senate inquiry into middle arm because we could not get any clear answers from our government. So to have me in there at the table and to help provide that transparency to the public is going to be crucial, and sort of shine a light on what is going on in there. And I want to set a standard for integrity too. The Greens don't accept corporate donations. People feel like both Labor and the CLP act on the dime of the gas industry, and I'm here to put the interests of my electorate first and foremost always.
And just quickly, finally, circling back to what we were saying, are you hopeful that this is going to be able to, I guess, spur the NT Greens on? And look, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves for 2028, but really both at that level, I guess I imagine some swings at the federal level in the NT as well, and also local elections next year where the Greens do run and endorse, and that is where the Greens in the NT have had representatives until now, of course.
Yeah, it really feels like we are just building and building momentum. It's so exciting. This is the beginning of a movement. We've had a history and we've built on it, but having this first seat at the table is just a really incredible moment that I feel can only go up from here. And it is motivated. And, the progressive community here in Nightcliff is very broad. There's lots of types of people here, but what we've done this time is really break out of those progressive bubbles to talk to. And that's, part of my background. I've worked in trades. I've worked in all sorts of areas. Being able to talk to people from all walks of life and bring them with you, meet them where they're at and bring them with you. And I think more and more people that maybe were not typically Greens voters before, I see, I've had people say to me, this is my first time I'm voting Greens in my life, and I'm so excited. I can only see that momentum building, and I'm already excited for 2028.
It's going to be fascinating to watch. Congratulations again. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Leo.
All right, finally today, former criminal Shane Cuthbert has announced his candidacy for the seat of Cairns at October's Queensland state election. Cuthbert is coming off a local council campaign, but he's running despite currently being banned from the state parliament. He spoke with 6 News to discuss why he's put his hand up.
I ran a campaign locally that was across those bigger statewide issues such as crime and housing. So I was already very much across that. I think the only thing I'm doing is targeting the voters a little bit differently. Obviously, I can't personally knock on every door in the electorate. It's far too big. It's Division 4, 5 and 7 here in Cairns for the state seat of Cairns. I ran in 4 and I was very, very adamant that I wanted to knock on every door. And I did that in 4. I actually did that twice through the year. And I think that's probably why I did get a lot of those votes, because a lot of people were coming up to me at pre-poll and saying, hey, I'm voting for you simply because you knocked on my door, you showed up. And I think that voters have seen, how much effort that I put in. I know that since the local council campaign, I've spent 2 to 3 nights a week in the CBD working with some of our most disadvantaged children. These are criminalised kids that are essentially breaking into homes and stealing cars. These are the youth that are causing some of the most crime in Cairns locally. but I'm getting my hands dirty, so to speak, at the ground level, volunteering my time to go out with them, not just to reduce crime and protect businesses in our CBD, but also to mentor those kids and try to steer them on the right path, because I do have that lived experience history as well.
I read in some local media when you've announced this, is it true you're indefinitely banned from state parliament?
Yes, so last year we had a regional sitting here in Cairns. For some reason, I still haven't got to the bottom of this. The Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, Curtis Pitt, who is also local to Cairns as well, he's just to the south of Cairns, had banned me indefinitely, and I had no reason. It said that I'd exhibited behaviour that would make attending Parliament difficult or something like that. Was very, very vague. This is considering that 2 weeks prior, I had been invited by I'm not sure which committee it was, but they were doing an inquiry into support provided to victims of crime. I met with those MPs, I shook their hands, I told my story, I made suggestions of how we could treat victims better. And then obviously post that committee and post the regional sitting, I was invited to speak again to the Youth Justice Reform Committee at the start of this year. So I've engaged with politicians before. It's really, really odd. If I had to take a guess, I would say it's probably because I used to be a Labor member. I was kicked out. There was a bit of a disagreement there, and I took them to the High Court. And I don't think they were very happy about that. In the end, the High Court refused to hear the matter. There was no winners and no losers. But I think, it cost the Labor Party a lot of money. Close to $1 million is the estimate that I was given. And so I don't think they were very happy about that. So I don't know if it's got something to do with that and it was a little bit more personal, or whether there's something going on behind the scenes that I'm not aware of. You said I took away 16.5% of the vote in Division 4. Now, although I was running in Division 4 specifically last time in the council election, my campaign spread far and wide. I was the only council candidate, at least here in Cairns, that was getting national media attention. I had a current affair. The night before the election, I had Channel 9 News do a story on election night. So I got a lot of attention, but I also ran a campaign, as I said, on statewide issues, a Cairns-wide campaign. So, when I think of maybe do I have that profile across Cairns, I think I certainly do. And, the message that I've been putting out to the, Cairns voters generally is that, yes, I've got a past, I've got a history, I own that. And I think that's what puts me in a really good position to understand crime and offending behaviour. I think this election campaign from at least the ALP and LNP perspective is, the rhetoric is very, very tough on crime. I mean, crime is one of the big issues, and both of the major parties are speaking about that. I think I've got a unique perspective on that, as somebody that's come through that system. As I said, I was invited to speak to the bipartisan Youth Justice Reform Select Committee at the start of the year. Unfortunately, disbanded, and I'm really disappointed about that, because I really worked really, really hard on that. I made a submission with a magistrate who actually sentenced me when I was a young person. We've come together full circle, and we worked on this submission where we had, real solutions to this problem. And I think that it was, being an election year, politics got in the way, and unfortunately, neither of the major parties were able to agree, and it got disbanded, and the recommendations were not put out. The LNP certainly didn't agree to those. So it's really disappointing, but I think it places me, again, I'm well placed, I think, in a position where I could actually have, some influence here, where I know what I'm talking about, and it is certainly one of the biggest issues still that I'm speaking, with people locally about.
Are you making a call yet about who you're going to recommend preferences to, or are you holding out on that for now?
I am scheduling a meeting hopefully next week with both Yolandi and Michael, who are the ALP and LNP candidates, and I'd like to sit down with them and have that conversation and also seek some commitments from them about some things that I want to see changed before I make that decision. So at the moment, I haven't, but those discussions will take place.
Shane Cuthbert speaking to Leo Puglisi there. Don't forget, if you want to catch any of these interviews, head right across to the 6 News YouTube channel to stream these stories and much more, all for free. Just search 6NewsAU to find us. That's Spotlight for now. Stay connected via 6 News on social media and on our websites, plus news on the hour every hour. For now though, I'm Austin Pollock. Thanks for your company, folks. Catch you next time.
The Prime Minister gets up and says this, and I'm thinking, does this come from Channel 6 News?
Thanks for having me on your wonderful program.
Online news site 6 News.
And it's really good. 6 News.
6 News.
One Labor source has told 6 News that the party has no chance of winning, while another believes the party is either way.
Stephen Miles, he was walking just down the road here.
Long time viewer, first time on the show. You can call me anytime.
Of all the stations and the clamouring journalists in Australia, she did the first interview with this kid.
Great story also of how our democracy is being run by high school students.
The system is broken and is time running out for your government.
It's such a repetitive issue, there simply aren't enough rentals available. Do you have a response to that?
Roman McKinnon and Austin Pollock sit down with the Queensland Premier Stephen Miles.
On loans and programs to support renters, and we want to support people to own their own home too.
Do you have a response to that?
That was a letter written by
Uncensored, streaming now on the 6 News YouTube channel.
For live, up-to-the-minute, impartial coverage of everything happening in Israel and Gaza, turn to 6 News.
Though Israel didn't start this war, Israel will finish it.
Pro-Palestine rallies took place.
Special coverage from here at home and overseas, right here on 6 News.
The Prime Minister gets up and says this, and I'm thinking, does this come from Channel 6 News?
Thanks for having me on your wonderful program.
Online news site 6 News.
And it's really good. 6 News.
6 News.
One Labor source has told 6 News that the party has no chance of winning, while another believes the party is either way.
Stephen Miles, he was walking just down the road here.
Long time viewer, first time on the show. You can call me anytime.
Of all the stations and the clamouring journalists in Australia, she did the first interview with this kid.
Great story also of how our democracy is being run by high school students.
Hello and welcome back to Between Parks Place in Capitol Hill. I'm your host, Stuart Jeffrey, GovCheck editor at 6 News.
And I'm Leo Puglisi, chief anchor at 6 News. Today we're talking all about Labor dissent, a history of dissent within the ALP. And of course, that has been pretty dominant in Australian political headlines, given what's happened with Senator Fatima Payman, who crossed the floor to support Palestinian state recognition and everything that has followed since then. It is obviously notable that something like this happens in Labor, isn't it, Stuart? Because they are so vehemently against floor crossing. It's all about caucus solidarity. Whereas you look at the Liberal Party and you see Bridget Archer crossing the floor on multiple occasions, and she remains in the party. She's not banished for that or anything. Now, Senator Payman doing this is the first time in a while that it's happened federally for Labor. At a state level, there was Kashulia Vagella in Victoria. But really, this goes back a while to the 80s and 90s. Graham Campbell, who went on to do work with Australia First and One Nation, he crossed the floor and he was well outspoken in the Labor Party, and eventually he was expelled. Here's a clip from the ABC in the mid-90s when Campbell was expelled, and then we're going to have a listen to a bit about Fatima Payman and the situation regarding her and the consequences for what she did.
After repeated breaches of ALP policy, rebel Labor backbencher Graham Campbell is set to lose pre-selection for the seat of Kalgoorlie. The last straw was Mr Campbell's weekend declaration that Labor's immigration policy and commitment to multiculturalism were stupid.
An unrepentant Graham Campbell was giving himself a big send-off today.
I can see the headlines now. Campbell sacked for telling the truth. Carmen Lawrence gets the bills paid for telling lies.
When I was crossing the floor, I crossed it knowing that there was going to be the potential expulsion as a consequence. But when I was crossing the floor, it was for my conscience and also understanding that I was standing for the ethos of the Labor Party, what we have put in the platform, what our rank and file members have asked for, what my West Australian constituents have called on, the young people that I've met, whether it's been on encampments, whether it's been during door knocking or at schools I visit. This has been the clear ask. And I've had communities reach out from Perth, Sydney, Melbourne, and, Victoria, New South Wales, rather. I don't want to just, geographically constrain them, but there's been a wide range of communities reaching out to me saying, I wish my local member would, follow you or be able to stand for a just resolution for Gaza, for Palestine. But this is about justice. This is about doing the right thing and being on the right side of history. And I just implore that and hope that by me continuing within the party, I can convince my colleagues to come on board.
I know obviously the party platform of the Labor Party does call for a two-state solution, and there are plenty of pro-Palestine rank and file members, as you've mentioned. But do you think a position like yours, which was directly crossing the floor to directly call for a Palestinian state and really overtly pro-Palestinian positions, do you think that is welcomed right now in terms of in the federal party room and with the current caucus?
I can't speak for my colleagues and everyone else within my caucus, but what I do know and what I've seen and witnessed is the long-term advocacy of many of my colleagues, some that have advocated longer than I've been on this earth for. So it is really important for me to ensure that what I've done isn't just a once-off gesture, but rather I know that this is part of an incremental move towards recognizing Palestine, but also it's about reinstating that hope within our communities, showing them that, yes, we do listen, we are representing your voices, and also it's important that, we were elected to be standing up for our values. It's not a homogenous caucus, so I do understand that, there's various perspectives within a caucus, but it is important in matters like this that we get to vote without conscience.
So obviously, Stuart, that was Graham Campbell there. Very different politics to Senator Fatima Payman, as you can imagine. But Labor dissent, again, rare, especially in the modern day. But this has gone back a while. And I think we really need to start Billy Hughes and the party that became the Nationalists, which became the UAP, which became the Liberal Party, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Billy Hughes, I guess, is the big one with National Labour Party, of course, splitting over the question of conscription during World War One, and I guess that's probably the biggest one. Of course, that's the Prime Minister leading the party as well. A lot of these splits are usually like opposing the Prime Minister or another faction, but in this instance, you've got the Prime Minister himself splitting from the party, and of course, eventually ended up joining in with what would become the National Party and what would become the Liberal Party, the UAP, during that process. But yeah, that's probably the biggest early split in any part of Australian politics. Of course, ignore the 1910s, the early 1900s. That's just a chaos for everyone involved, as I'm sure you and I both know. But Billy Hughes being the first big split there.
Yeah, absolutely. And what he did, right? The National Labor Party barely existed, right? It was kind of a temporary limbo period. Then they formed a merger with the Liberal Party, aka the Commonwealth Liberal Party, Fusion Liberal Party, whatever you want to call them, Deakin Liberal Party. There's a lot of names. You get the idea. And then, of course, they merged with the Nationalists there. But I mean, that is, hugely significant. And unlike, of course, in the other cases we're going to talk about, or in the current Fatima Payman situation, you don't have the party leader going against Hughes for doing this, because he was the party leader. It just was an extraordinary situation.
I mean, you're looking at a time where Labor's rule against crossing the floor didn't really exist yet. It wasn't really formalized. And this, I reckon probably part of it was because of this. No doubt, going back to this very early split, because, yeah, Labor crossing the floor to the extent that they crossed permanently. And, of course, set Labor back, and they weren't really a presence, at least federally, until the 1920s, because, well, you took half the party. And I guess that indicates that typically with the Liberal Party, or then their predecessors, tend to merge and re-merge and split often. Whereas Labor doesn't split often, but when it does, it really does split. As DLP, Democratic Labour Party, being the other big split that everyone knows. They're also little splinters, but they do have these occasional big splits. Whereas the Liberals, Nationals, whatever you want to have, they tend to, constantly reforming as they go.
Absolutely. And look, we'll get into the DLP a little later. Of course, you have to look, we can talk about Billy Hughes all day, right? In terms of the parties he was in. He ended up, by the way, it's not often you see this. He started, I think, in a socialist league. But he really was in Labor, and then he ended up, by the time of his death, he was in the Liberal Party, which also speaks to how long this guy was in Parliament for. I think it was 3 seats over multiple states. I mean, Billy Hughes, we can do a whole video on Billy Hughes, a whole episode between Parks Place and Capitol Hill on Billy Hughes. I'm sure we will sometime down the line, because he is just such an incredible person in Australian politics, love him or not. Then I'm not sure who in 2024 has hugely strong opinions about Billy Hughes. We'll fast forward about 20 years, right? Jack Lang. Again, we could talk about Jack Lang for a while, but he was involved in, I guess, a number of splinter parties, including not just in his home state of New South Wales. It's also affected other places like South Australia. But Lang Labor, talk to us about that.
Lang Labor is probably, of the 3 big splits, this is the one people talk less about. I believe he's tried to split off twice, because he was the Premier of New South Wales in Labor there. Again, probably a party leader who did split off, or in a way they're very much dissenting. He was adopting policies that were more, I guess, akin to FDR in the US, ones that were a bit more like welfare based, and that of course didn't gel well with federal Labor, and ended up causing Lang Labor to split off. And so for a couple of elections there, you had, again, 2 Labors, and that's going into World War II, because you didn't get Curtin and that kind of, seals the deal, the end of Lang Labor when you get Curtin in. But the Curtin, Chifley, and those, the 3 leaders there. But going into early World War I, you did have this kind of Lang Labor split. Even when they did remerge, they again split later on, because you already had the seeds already sown for it. So you had a bit of dissenting there, a bit of instability there. And I'm sure, again, that's also played a role in cementing that no dissent rule, no crossing the floor in Parliament.
And it was interesting, right, Stuart, because this Lang Labor thing, I mean, we talked about National Labor, right, which lasted, a year, less than a year? Lang Labor as a party was going on for 2 decades in various forms. It was a faction, of course, as well. And it's interesting reading the Wikipedia page on it. And this one particular line, quote, after a series of unity conferences, Lang Labor was readmitted into the official ALP in 1936, with Lang remaining the party state leader. He was deposed in 39, and then they formed another party, the Australian Labor Party non-communist, which should not be confused. And again, this happens with splits, should not be confused with the Australian Labor Party anti-communist, which we'll get to in a second, the DLP. But yeah, he had this kind of impact until, again, like 1950, so right throughout World War II. Again, Lang as a person is quite extraordinary. But that's pretty significant in terms of how long Labor, especially in New South Wales, is having to deal with a splinter party, another party taking its name, and with a very significant figure leading it.
Exactly, and of course that goes into your early Menzies years, and still causing a problem in the early Menzies years. We all talk about the World War II three prime ministers. You've got from starting in 1942 to 1949. You've got a strong Labor prime ministership there, but even then, Jack Lang's causing them problems. Of course, they did have a strong majority. Well, of course, you had the National Cabinet to start with during the war, but they did keep that control. Of course, you've got the referendums where they tried to get more of these social welfare-based changes into the constitution. Of course, the big one there, the big successful one being what's now the welfare power, which is ironically what Jack Lang was supporting. Labor finally came around on that and said, yeah, we'll put that in. They got Menzies to side with them on it, so they actually got, there's one for you, Menzies supported social welfare. How's that for breaking trends? But even during this whole time, you've got Jack Lang agreeing with them for once on that, but a general opposition to them, thinking that they weren't doing enough for the working class during the Great Depression, which is where he really came in. Again, you draw the FDR comparison there, where you've got that more involvement from, I guess, the welfare perspective, but not just that, he still was a pretty successful, I think it's like economics, of course. He was originally the treasurer, so he has that background as well. So solid economics, solid welfare. And that's really a problem for Labor, because you do have this, we mentioned, of course, it being the non-communists or the anti-communists, and being several splits there over that issue. But you do get the sense that this is a question that Labor dealt with through the 50s, but also through the 60s and the 70s with DLP, of course, which we'll get to in a second. But you do have this. He was successful, he was popular, and so when he split, a lot of the party went with him. He was never in contesting for the prime ministership, because Lang Labor never had enough votes to get to that. Of course, you can't call it splitting the vote because we've got preference voting. So if this was America, you call it splitting the vote. Fortunately, we have preferential voting, so that never really happened. But Lang never in the running there to be the prime minister. They're still smaller than Labor, so they were the third party. Labor and, of course, what's now the Liberals were still the big two. But you do have Lang Labor in there as a force against Labor Party themselves, stealing Labor seats, but not having much success in Liberal seats.
And I note, obviously, on the preference question, just going back a bit, when National Labor was formed, it was still first past the post. And they only lasted a year. And then, of course, they merged into the Nationalists. But if you imagine National Labor had stuck around for a bit longer, the kind of mess that would cause, especially for Labor. But it didn't happen, at least federally. Moving quickly on to other parties with the name Labor in them, the Australian Labor Party, anti-communist, which became the Democratic Labor Party. Now, we stress that party disbanded in the late 70s. The current party, I know it claims its history. It's not the same party. They were different parties, same name. But the DLP, we'll say DLP just for the sake of it, even though they weren't known as that originally. And again, that is a pretty well-known one. Of course, it's in the memories of some people still alive today.
Exactly. That is the third of the three big splits. It's probably the most well-known of the three because it's more recent. And as you still had Jack Lang, the Lang Labor causing problems, you've then got, DLP splits, you're Catholic, right? And we'll come back to that being a bit of an issue for Labor in the first few decades. But the Catholic right splitting or disagreeing with the rest of the parties is where you get your anti-communism again coming into it, because saying that Labor is moving too close to the Soviets. This is, of course, 1950s, talking about domino theory, which was dominant in US foreign policy. And of course, that comes to the Australian foreign policy, is that if one country falls, other countries will fall and follow them. So this policy of, this is your peak US anti-communist period, and that influencing DLP here and the Liberal Party. Whereas Lang Labor was never in contesting for the prime ministership, DLP were. They were a lot more popular,
and they were big in the Senate as well, which was really key.
Exactly, yeah. Having that Senate seat, and of course that goes to Whitlam. Goes towards the Whitlam years, where you still have DLP causing problems with the Senate. Of course, not to the same level, because they did die off in the 70s a bit. Of course, they did end up dissolving them as well. But you've got this split in the 50s. You've got Everett trying to deal with this. He was the foreign affairs minister during the late 40s, running the UN, and also legislation in Australia. Of course, the only person to resign from the High Court and go back into politics. So it was his leadership during that time, and he managed to hold the party together enough to get them through to the 1960s, where they started chipping away at Menzies. But the DLP there, kind of during the Menzies years, meant that Labor could not replace Menzies until could not take over enough to get Menzies taken out, and they couldn't do that until, in fact, Whitlam at the very end of the 60s there, start of the 70s, because that's one of the reasons why we have this Menzies prime ministership, longest serving prime minister in Australia, both consecutive and non-consecutive. And this is why you had a DLP, they're kind of, whether you want to call it sabotaging or siphoning or splitting the vote. Ultimately, they did manage to steal enough seats from Labor that Labor was on a force for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And DLP themselves were pretty short on seats once the incumbents who had defected ran for re-election. That was evident in the state level as well. A lot of them just weren't around for that long. The Senate, of course, was a different story, as we mentioned. And by the way, just on Menzies DLP, I believe that Menzies did vote for the DLP in his later years. I just had to mention that because I've seen that around. Moving back, I should say, to something a bit less known, right? Because there are plenty of splinter parties that were among rank and file members, or just among like a single MP decided to do it, or at the local level. The Protestant Independent Labor Party, which was around for some years, and again is one of those parties that's come off Labor. Didn't have too much success though. What do we actually know about this? Because I would bet that from those who have watched the whole way through, a lot of them wouldn't know a thing about this.
Yeah, so this is the very, very beginning of the kind of the Catholic versus Protestant fight within the Labor Party, DLP being the big end of it. But this goes the whole way back again. A thing that people often skip over is that the conscription issue in Labor was largely a religion thing. There was a lot of talking like the Quakers, for example, in the US, but you've got a big religious split over conscription and whether or not you should send the boys to fight in a foreign war. And so that's where you come into the progressive, the Protestant Labor kind of splitting off because of largely this religious issue. Of course, they did literally call themselves the Protestant Independent Labor Party, so you've got that in there. And again, James Scullin was the first Catholic Prime Minister. He was Labor. Catholics and Labor go back to the very, very beginning of Australian politics, or at least after Federation. And again, it wasn't overly successful. As you mentioned, like once the defectors are no longer in office, the party dies off. We had the same thing here, Walter Skelton, and of course the only reason he was succeeding in New South Wales was because you had the multi-member seats. If you didn't have that, that wouldn't really be an issue. And of course, this
we had Hare Clark for a bit in the 1920s in New South Wales. Bring it back, I say. But go on.
Yeah, so that split off in 1923. It did pretty much die off. The party kept going for a while, but that pretty much died off. Well, because Skelton lost he was out of power with the 1927 elections, and in 1928 he stood for a by-election. And once he was out, that really died off. They did stay on with Queensland and South Australia, but again, one MP each. And this is during the Billy Hughes years, and they still managed to get some success, but not much. By the time they were going when Jack Lang split off, but going, as in, well, they only had one MP left, and it was in Queensland at that point in time. But it does speak to this issue of Catholics and Protestants within Labor, because you had the Social Democrats in there as well. This is the very, very early few decades. And so this kind of speaks to this issue that people think of, DLP, Catholic right, splitting off. So this is more subtle, but that split does go back to the 20s, to the 1910s. It does indicate that there's, there's not one Labor. It's transforming as it goes. Catholics were the dominant force in Labor. You get to DLP, and that's the Catholic right splitting off. But the non-Catholic party leadership there, because I mentioned James Scullin. So this is your early years strong Catholic force. By the time of the DLP, the Catholics dying off, and that's a more secular party. Of course, the Liberals are usually seen as being Protestant conservative, but even they're becoming a bit more secular as Christianity loses its popularity a bit as you look at the census results. But these early years, very much a religious issue within Labor as they're trying to reform their party image, moving along. So, of course, you do have the Irish Republicans playing a role in early Labor years as well. That was in the 1910s, early 1920s, but that was pretty much died off by the early 1920s, which is when Protestant independent Labor formed. So you do have a couple of these issues, this issue of relationship with the Crown and the issue of faith in Labor playing a role. There were several splits at this point in time. Protestant Labor probably being the biggest one. We say biggest. They had 3 MPs, and only because you had the multi MP seats. Had you not had that, they wouldn't be an issue, because they never secured, none of their candidates ever secured enough of the vote to be elected on their own right, although you didn't really have preferential voting and you got multi-member seats. So do you really know? Well, we can't say for certain. Skelton himself might have been elected even if he had one MP seats, but it's this early origin of the idea of Labor can dissent, and this non-dissenting rule that we have now with Fatima Payman's is now looking at herself after crossing the floor. It's again in response to all of these splits that Labor brings in this rule.
Yeah, exactly. I'm conscious of time here, but it's just interesting going through the Wikipedia category on ALP breakaway groups, and there's so many. Rex Connor Labor, Blackburn Mutton Labor, the current day Family First was formed by 2 Labor ministers, Industrial Labor, Industrial Socialist Labor, Majority Labor, the National Party in South Australia, not the current Nationals, North Queensland Labor.
Right. So that's still an issue.
Yeah, exactly. The Official Labor Movement, Parliamentary Labor, Progressive Labor, Queensland Labor, which was an offshoot of the DLP, State Labor, and the United Australia Party, the old Menzies era one, was actually formed from a Labor split. Look, just quickly, Stuart, I like to tweet it, talk about a 4th Labor split, whether that could ever happen. We know, obviously, that there are 2 very clear factions within Labor left and Labor right. In some way, they've, at least federally in the caucus, have formed agreements and not split again. And we've mentioned that they're trying to avoid massive situations like this. Can you ever foresee an issue significant enough that would actually break Labor apart? Maybe not necessarily on a major scale like DLP, NLP, Lang Labor, but, in a few branches, you could have entire branches turning to a new party or something like that. Could you ever foresee that?
Yeah, look, it's definitely, if it does become an issue, this might be one of the causes of it, would be this split over Israel and Palestine. But it is a topical issue. We don't know how long the war's going to go on for there. There's 2-party state solution, or two-state solution, or what happens.
Too involved in politics,
play a role.
2-party solution.
Yep, I mean, it pretty much is, considered as the national cabinet in Israel now. But yeah, 2-state solution, not 2-party solution. Yeah, exactly. But this could become a cause. Of course, we have had a few alarm bells going, well, is it again, Family First was revived by 2 Labor MPs. You do go, is this going to be a split? No. Fortunately for Labor, they haven't had a major split in recent terms. It's more of a shaving off the edges kind of approach. You'll have one person splitting here, one person splitting there. Official Labour movement, for example, 2 council seats they split off in the 1950s, just before DLP, but they died off when DLP started. You do have these little fractions and splinters there, but that's usually only 1 or 2 MPs. You don't have the same extent to this Liberal. The Nationals, of course, they could be splitting now in New South Wales over a dispute there, so you don't have the same level. And fortunately, that no dissenting rule has kind of kept that controlled, although if they have a 4th split, it'll be massive, because this has kind of kept down dissent in the party. If there's a resistance to this, it will be a big split. And because the dissenting rules kind of kept everyone all together, no crossing the floor. But as soon as something causes a split, it will split massively, because you've got this tension in the party when these split. And of course, Fatima Payman is kind of an example of that. But it is just 1 MP here. But if we have a split, it'll be a big split.
All right, we will be watching all of this with interest. There are just so many, as you mentioned, there of these little tiny ones, Blackburn, Mutton, Progressive Labor, that have really just emerged of a handful of people and haven't really had much impact, but they're still breakaway groups, big or small. That is between Parkes Place and Capitol Hill for today. Remember, you can, of course, stream every single episode of the program on the 6 News YouTube channel and watch all the latest headlines live 24/7. Also on the 6 News YouTube channel and our website, SIXNewsAU.com. We can also access the latest GovCheck content. I'm Leo Puglisi.
I'm Stuart Jeffrey. Thank you for watching.
Law and government coverage like nobody else. Our dedicated 6 News GovCheck team provides an in-depth analysis of law and government issues and current affairs, offering unrivaled knowledge with reporters both at home and abroad.
Your 24/7 source for unbiased news coverage with our dedicated team, bringing you more variety, more content and more updates around the clock. Tune in and stay ahead with 6 News, your go-to destination for news that matters.
On 6 News, we do politics differently.
Welcome to Uncensored.
Thanks for having me on your wonderful program.
Are you confident that you can defeat David Chris-Fully?
From long-form unedited interviews to taking a deep dive into Australian law and government.
Sure. That's when you recant the respect for Indigenous Australians. Why axe them?
Well, it's certainly heating up outside here in Brisbane, and it will be heating up inside Parliament right now.
6 News understands talks about removing Palaszczuk have been ongoing.
The Health Australia Party has warned they may shut